Hello, I'm Robert Royal, and I'm the editor-in-chief of The Catholic Thing. I'd like to welcome you to this latest in our series of Catholic Thing podcasts. For those of you who don't already know us, The Catholic Thing is an online daily column series, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Our columns are short by design, under 1,000 words, so that while drinking a cup of coffee or in just a few minutes, you can get a brief but substantial commentary on faith and reason or the church in the world by some of the very best Catholic writers and thinkers. You can subscribe to The Catholic Thing. It's free by going to our website, www.thecatholicthing.org, all lowercase, and enter your email address. It's simple, and you'll receive the column every day in your inbox at 6 a.m. Give it a try. We're sure you'll be glad that you did.
We're very fortunate today to have with us Father Jeffrey Kirby, who is the pastor of Our Lady of Grace Church in South Carolina. He's also a widely published author, writer of books, and a professor at Belmont Abbey College down in North Carolina, not far from this parish. Father Kirby, it's great to see you again. I've been a guest at your parish, and it's a wonderful, dynamic community. I just love that place, and I hope everything is going well despite everything that's going on in the world.
Yeah, it's good to be on this podcast. Good to see you, and the people still speak of your lecture you gave here. I think it's taking a little time to process it, but it was extremely good. So
yeah, it was a great experience. I love being down there. Well, listen, we've got Father Kirby here with us today because he's got a new book out. As I said, he's got several books that he's written, and this one I thought would be interesting to the viewers of the Catholic Thing podcast, because it's a little bit different than what we've done in the past. We're not going to be getting into large-scale political or philosophical or historical questions. Father Kirby's book, which I'm going to hold up, and I hope you're going to be able to see, I hope it's not reversed on the Zoom, has a very interesting title. It's called Thy Kingdom Come, Living the Lord's Prayer in Everyday Life. It's published by Tan Books. You can get it at Tan Books, or I guess from other outlets as well. And what intrigued me about the title of this book is probably all of us who are involved in this production, those of you who are watching, everybody at the Catholic Thing probably says the Our Father every day. But the question of living the Our Father, the specifics of living the Our Father, I think are quite interesting. In the introduction to this book, it's said that the Pater Noster, the Our Father, has been called the summary of the whole gospel. And Thomas Aquinas says of it that it is the most perfect of prayers. It's the Lord's Prayer, after all. So, Father Kirby, can you get us started? Explain a little bit why this is a summary of the whole gospel and the most perfect of prayers.
Yeah, so it's very powerful about the Lord's Prayers. The context, especially in Matthew's gospel, in which it's given, that the apostles are watching the Lord pray. He starts his day in prayer. He concludes his day in prayer. And the apostles are watching this, and it takes them a while, but after some time, eventually, as he returns from prayer one evening, the apostles turn and they say, Lord, teach us to pray. And you can imagine the Lord was thinking, finally, you know what I mean? He's been waiting for this inquiry. And he says, when you pray, this is how you are to pray. So the context is very important because it shows that the Lord's Prayer, when the Lord gave it, flowed from his own prayer to the Father. So when we pray the Lord's Prayer, we're not simply reciting or praying a prayer that he gave us, but spiritually, we're very much participating in his prayer to the Father. And that relationship, of course, is the heart of the gospel. And of course, through the Lord's Prayer, those 7 tenets of the Lord's Prayer, we see a reflection, a summary of all that the Lord taught. So it is practically a summation, spiritually a summation, in that it is the Lord revealing the face of our Father to us. It is the Lord allowing us to participate in his prayer. So for these ways, especially, we see that the Lord's Prayer is unique and preeminent among all prayers in our tradition.
Very good, very good. Thank you. Yeah, I think a lot of people find trouble in prayer. I know I do at times, and I think all of us probably do at times. So to have some sort of instruction and to have some help. And what I like about this book is that it's concrete and it's practical as much as it's sort of theoretical. One person has described this book as having a sort of dogmatic spirituality. You mentioned the 7 petitions. That's what they're called traditionally in Catholicism. The 7 petitions in the Lord's Prayer. Could you describe those a little bit, and why did this person feel that it was a good thing to call this dogmatic spirituality. I myself, whenever I hear the term spirituality these days, we hear so many people say, I'm spiritual but not religious, meaning they would like to be vaguely, I don't know, mystical or something, but they don't really like dogmatic teachings in morals or in faith. So tell us a bit about these 7 petitions and the dogmatic side. You're both a pastor and a teacher, so I guess you're the perfect guy for this.
Exactly. Get both the trenches and the classroom of sorts. Well, I think that the Lord's Prayer itself, as you mentioned, is divided among these 7 different parts. And in terms of a dogmatic spirituality, I like that. I'm impressed that another could read it and see that in the text that's written. Because like yourself, we hear spirituality, it sounds so sporadic and fluid. We don't even know what that means anymore. Traditionally, we would have used the term ascetical theology. And so to say it's a dogmatic spirituality, I like that, because if I could draw from that saying, it's dogma is the foundations, it's the teachings, it's how we know God. It's how we know the true God, as opposed to our opinion or to the passing preferences or fads of our culture. So I like that. And then with this dogmatic spirituality, if we dived into it, these 7 parts of the Lord's Prayer. So the first 3 pertain to our relation with God himself. The last 4 pertain to our relationship with God, but also our neighbor. And in that way, the early fathers saw a connection between the Lord's Prayer and the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments, which traditionally we say the first 3 of the commandments pertain to God. The last 7 pertain to our relationship with neighbors. So the Father saw a clear connection and fulfillment, the connection between the Decalogue and the Lord's Prayer, and then a fulfillment of the Decalogue in the Lord's Prayer. So those first 3 petitions that relate to God, it speaks about God's name, God's kingdom, and God's will. Those are 3 powerful things and very much interconnected in terms of knowing who God is, honoring and revering him, and properly praising him and showing him due homage. And then, of course, it flows into the last 4. And those 4 pertain, again, to our relationship with God, but also our neighbor. So they're defined by the verbs that we use. Give us, forgive us, lead us, deliver us. These petitions that we're placing before God in order that we can fully live the way of life that the Lord has shown us. So those are the 7 that parallel with the Decalogue. Also, I want to just mention, I find this fascinating, that the early fathers also saw a connection between the 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit, the 7 Beatitudes. Because in the early teachings, we believe that there were 7 Beatitudes. The 8th Beatitude, what we call the 8th Beatitude, was the commissioning to go and suffer persecution for the sake of righteousness. So the early fathers saw the 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit, the 7 Beatitudes, the 7 Christian virtues, and the 7 portions of the Lord's Prayer, all as forming a type of dynamism. That's what they used in the early church to instruct the unbeliever on how to become a believer and then live the Christian way of life.
I ought to say for the viewers that you've got a beautiful chart. It may sound complicated how all these 7s are related with one another, but Father has got a beautiful, simple chart that lays out how one thing goes to another toward the end of the book, where he sort of summarizes the things that are said in each chapter. And then I think you have some marvelously clear, good, and practical advice in each of those chapters on each of these petitions and how they connect with those other things, which in my experience is quite rare. The book is just barely 150 pages, and it's very, very easy to read through, and I think easy for most people to appropriate. So that's a great gift that you've been able to give us by connecting these things that, they have very deep roots, of course, in a very long Catholic tradition.
Yes, very much. And I find just by, retrieving these parts of our tradition, I just find a certain dynamism being restored. When we have that dogmatic spirituality, then it's the Holy Spirit that's working. St. Paul says we don't know how to pray as we ought. When we engage this, then this dynamism is brought forth, this interaction, this kind of zeal that's brought forth in the soul. And I think that, oftentimes if we don't do that, then as Christians, we run the task of the possibility of getting bored. Pope Benedict says that the West is existentially bored with Christianity. And in large part because we've abandoned our spiritual patrimony, right? If we make the Christian way of life merely a moral code or merely a set of beliefs, that we've missed something. This
Or
is
really just not niceness toward one another.
right. Oh my
I
goodness.
mean,
Yeah, it's even
any
worse.
root in reality or in God.
Right, exactly. It's just simply, it becomes almost a disguise for something else, whether it's politics or control or some type of ideology. So I love that before we were called Christians in Acts of the Apostles, we're told we were, our faith was, we were called members of the way. And I think that really, again, goes back to that vintage faith that we're all called to have, that we are followers of the way. This is a way of life, a way of believing, a way of praying, and that dynamism. My hope, and I'm glad to hear your thoughts on the book so far, is that the book really helps people to understand that when the Lord gives us this prayer, he's instructing us how to pray, how to live, how to have that vibrancy as a child of God. And I think that so much of our answers to our contemporary problems can be found in the Lord's Prayer.
I mean, quite concretely, we have the apostles, these holy men who want to follow him, who ask him, how do we do it? So if you had to sum up, I mean, you give a lot of practical advice in the course of these 7 chapters. So, for the average person who's watching today, how do you go about this? I mean, practically speaking, how do you bring this more dogmatic or conceptual side of what's in the prayer into your spirituality, into your daily life?
Yes. First of all, I want to admit that, for many of us, the odds are against us in that we learned this prayer when we were learning to talk. This was, for many of us, one of the first prayers we learned, along with the Hail Mary and perhaps a few others. So it's difficult because it's so familiar to us. It's a part of us. Like when I'm ministering to people who are dying and they haven't spoken in days, I start to say the Lord's Prayer and they start to mouth the prayer. Like it just becomes a part of our soul. And so when it's become so familiar, it can either breed affection or contempt, and familiarity or over familiarity. And I think that's where many of us can be. So my hope in the book is that we stop and pause a little bit and just walk through each of the parts of the Lord's Prayer, attempting to really understand what's being said. And to your point, in the book, I wanted to be practical. So I provide an examination of conscience. I provide sporadic bullet points about different situations or different states of life, or how this might apply. There's a set of truths, bullet points of truths, of takeaways from the chapter. I tried everything possible in each of the chapters to really make each part of the Lord's Prayer eminently practical and applicable to each person. So wait a minute, this actually helped me. This is actually good stuff, which is the point of our ascetical tradition.
Good. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? I know you through your books. I know you through meeting you at your beautiful parish there. I was surprised when I started to read your book that you're from a military family. But just for the sake of our viewers, give us a little of your background about where you came from, how you entered into the priesthood. You've studied in several places and you're teaching various subjects. And I think a lot of our viewers would just like to know a little bit about Father Kirby.
Oh, okay. I hope I don't bore them.
A little bit about Father Kirby.
right, exactly. The early years. No. So just some highlights. As you mentioned, a military family. I grew up, my father was in air defense. So we bounced back and forth between Fort Hood, Texas, and different assignments in what was then West Germany. So that very much instilled in me a proper understanding for, democratic republic, for the real value and fragility of goodness and freedom, and the importance that good people stand up and fight for what is right. So this was just the air that I breathed as a child, and was surrounded by this heavy American presence that was in a foreign land in order to defend freedom, and this continuation of this World War II legacy. So that very much, I think, has influenced a lot of my thinking. So South Carolina eventually became home because my dad retired here. And then the Southern culture just fit. People sometimes ask me, where was home before South Carolina? I don't hear an accent, they say. I said, before South Carolina was the United States Army, And
which is a parallel world. A lot of people don't realize that.
Exactly. It's this little bubble of sorts, but a remarkable experience in terms of the lessons learned. And then when South Carolina became home, so much of Southern culture just fit the values and the worldview that I had been taught as an Army brat. So South Carolina was home, went to school here, graduated high school, went out to Steubenville up in Franciscan University.
Oh.
And then after that, taught high school for a year in Charleston. And then that was kind of a discernment year because I was debating whether law school or seminary. And seminary won out.
You
And
made the right choice.
I
We don't need another lawyer. You made the
That's
right
right. I hear that so often. It's great. And then went off to the NAC, the North American College for seminary, came home, was in a parish as a parochial vicar, went back to study moral theology at Holy Cross University, and then
These
came
are
back
both in Rome, by the way, we should tell the viewers.
in Rome, right? In Rome, yep, in Rome. And then was a vocations director in my diocese, and then went back to Rome to finish a doctorate in moral theology. And now I'm assigned here. And the parish here, I love it. We're one of the newest parishes in the United States. We're a little under 4 years old. They're closing churches or merging churches in the Northeast. We're building churches here in the Southeast. And with that newness, there's a great opportunity that a lot of pastors don't have. And I realize that, and I'm grateful. And I have very much tried to take the vision of Pope St. John Paul II to task in forming and molding this community from day one. Because what pastor ever has that opportunity?
Right.
And very much have gone back to his earlier writings, especially, and have tried to use John Paul II and others of the great ones to really mold and shape the parish's life, and really allowing the liturgical, sacramental, and spiritual life to be preeminent, and really just setting that up as the standard.
I mean, it shows. It showed immediately when I was down there, and I've actually recommended to several people if they're in the area to stop in and see you. Given all that experience, I want to put a tough question to you. I hope many people will go to the book for the enlightenment that they're going to find there, but we're at a very strange time in both the church and the world, and a lot of people are groping for guidance of any sort at this point. That's one of the reasons why I think going back to those basic prayers, principles like the Our Father, and trying to really reroot ourselves in the tradition is so deeply important. Given the breadth of experience you've had both as a pastor and as a thinker and as a writer, how do you think we help people best who are in this situation of not knowing? I hear from this as the editor of the Catholic Thing all the time. People just say, where do I turn? I'm glad the Catholic Thing is there, but where else do I turn? What if my parish isn't good? What do I do? What's your advice to people who find, and there are a lot of them out there, believe me, what's your advice to people out there who find themselves in those circumstances?
Yes, I first try to be as candid and yet hope-filled as possible. I think it's important that we are candid and honest with people, especially as they are trying to authentically grow in their relationship with God. So I try to give a lay of the land, and in many places it's bleak, So in terms of where they can go, or what confessors they should seek out, or where the liturgy is actually a worship of God rather than this indulgence in humanism. So it can be very difficult. So I try to be forthright, but emphasize as much hope as possible, because I tell people that, and remind us all, that the greatest source of reform in the church is holiness. So even if you're in a bad parish or just a weak parish or whatever the situation might be, that the means of holiness are provided. They're there. So whether that's the sacraments preeminently, or whether it's the spiritual masterpieces, whether it's a life of prayer, such as the Rosary, the Divine Mercy Chaplet, whatever it might be, I encourage people, to allow themselves to become an oasis of holiness in the midst of an otherwise dark landscape. Here in the Southeast, I sometimes joke with people because we know that the war between the states ended, and in many places people didn't hear that the war had ended. So there were still battles going on, even though the war was over. And sometimes I use that imagery because I remind people that in many respects, we were in a culture war. When people say that we're not in a culture war anymore, I scratch my head in one sense in terms of how people might mean that. But in the others I've thought about, I've realized, I think maybe we're not in a culture war anymore, but not in the sense that it never happened, but that we just lost. And some of us just haven't gotten the memo yet. But I don't mean that in a dark way. I mean that if we've lost the culture of war, then now more than ever, retrieving that vintage Christianity, the early spirit of the forefathers and foremothers of our faith, this is a time for us to shine, right? This is when, as Christians, like, this is our moment. Perhaps, we are better poised than ever before to represent the gospel in all its freshness and all its irresistibility. So I try to encourage people in that way, just so that they can understand that, the task is still before us, even if the horizon can be distressing.
Yeah. Well, when I'm looking for inspiration, I say to myself, John Paul II and others labored mightily against the Soviet Union, this great, awful axis of evil, this evil power that had thousands of nuclear weapons and a huge army. And no one knew that it could collapse because it was built on lies. It was built on nothing. And so I think you're right. And in fact, I think the situation is good in a way that people don't know the Our Father. And it isn't something that is just kind of automatic for them. It's something that they come on fresh. And there are opportunities if we're able to take care of them in the way that we ought to. Father, I would really like to go on very much longer with this, but I've made it a rule for these podcasts, as I have for the Catholic thing, as you know, because you've written for us a couple of times, that we have very strict length, because I want to make sure people actually read and listen to these things, and we don't go and abuse their attention spans these days. But let me say again, and I'm going to hold it up again, Thy kingdom come, living the Lord's Prayer in everyday life at TAN Books. Father Jeffrey Kirby, thank you very much. And we hope we may be able to get you back again someday when you've got another volume to help instruct us on what we need to be doing at this point. Thanks very much, and goodbye to everybody out there.